Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of That's Wild, Tales from the Human Side of Nature. I'm your host, Mike Skargerlind. We're so glad you're with us today to listen to another story in this storytelling event series from New Jersey Audubon. That's Wild is a showcase of stories by people from all walks of life who share their experiences in and with nature and the influence that nature's had on them as people, on their lives, and indeed those around them. Every story on That's Wild is quite different because all of the guests are quite different, but they're all real and they're told by those who experience them. Before I introduce our storyteller today, here's a couple of ways that you can get involved in this show, or indeed in future ones. If you'd like to ask our tale teller a question, just look out for the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window. You can click that and type your question in the box that then appears. Your question will be collected during the story and may be selected for the Q&A session that will follow directly after the story has ended. And don't forget, if you would like to submit a story to That's Wild, we've set up a submission page on the New Jersey Audubon website at njaudubon.org/that's-wild. Tell us your story. You never know, you may get picked for a future episode. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce today's tale teller. Virginia Rose is the founder and president of Birdability, a Texas-based but nationally focused nonprofit organization that shares the joys of birding with people who have disabilities and works to ensure that birding is accessible for everybody. Virginia is a retired high school English teacher and a wheelchair user who is passionate about bringing the same joy, empowerment, and community she found in birding and nature to others who have mobility or other accessibility challenges. Her story today is called Finding Your Best Self in Nature. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Virginia Rose. Over to you, Virginia.
Thank you so much, Mike. I appreciate you and your time. Sitting entirely alone in a springtime, aromatic East Texas forest, I was stunned with bird song, spellbound. The fluted ethereal tones of the wood thrush, the twit, twit, twitio of the hooded warbler, the high sewing machine song of the pine warbler, and the tweety, 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 tweety-da-meet of the yellow-throated warbler. I realized I was meeting my best self and was happier than I'd ever been. In 1973, I was 14 years old, living in Evergreen, Colorado, a beautiful mountain town outside of Denver. I was riding my horse at a nearby rural homestead when, startled, he bolted and ran wildly for home, jumping ditches and careening through pine forests. Try as I might, I could not stop him, and I was too afraid to jump off, convinced that I would hurt myself. I flattened my body and my head against his neck and held on for all I was worth. Minutes later, I was lying on the ground, face up, listening to a strange thrumming sound. I saw blood on my horse as he cantered away, leaving me paralyzed underneath vibrating guide wires. Nearly 30 years later, at age 42, I found birding and life changed. I found a purpose, a reason to be outside again, to explore nature, and as it turns out, discover my best self. I called my mom immediately with that realization, and I said, "Mom, why didn't you tell me I was a nerd? My life would have been so much easier." Maybe some of you can relate with that. But being in nature in a wheelchair presented its own difficulties and uncertainties. You may have noticed, nature provides all types of difficulties and uncertainties, but especially for people in wheelchairs. Let me list some of those for you, starting with dirt, storms, snow, roots, rocks, ruts, cactus, gravity, trees, just to name a few. I could regale you for hours with stories, usually hilarious in retrospect, about encounters with each and every one of these items. Here's one. On a road trip from Austin to South Dakota, camping, alone, for weeks, without a cell phone. Why? To be in nature, to call on myself, and to figure out what I was made of. Dusk is falling and a storm is brewing as I pull into a campground that appeared mysteriously out of a Nebraska cornfield, thank God. I pull into the campground, I park, and I make 4 trips from my car to the campsite with a lap full of tent, sleeping bag, thermarest, lantern, cooler, and clothes. At last, inside my tent and inside my sleeping bag, I try to fall asleep, but the wind and rain are ferocious. The sides of the tent are blowing in and out and up and down. And concerned about falling trees, I decide to pull my wheelchair inside the tent and situate myself under it. It's titanium after all. Hours later, birdsong wakes me. The Carolina wrens, or the morning birds, as Mom calls them, announced a new day. I scurried out from underneath my wheelchair. I unzipped the tent and gazed outside. I was inexpressibly happy to have survived the storm on my own and to witness the beautiful, just washed early day waiting for me. I scrambled into my wheelchair and grabbed my binoculars and headed out. And here's another. This is as a leader in training at the Rio Grande Valley Birding Festival. And I was assigned to accompany a birding guide, a walking birding guide at the beautiful Santa Ana Wildlife Refuge. It had been raining the night before, and we were all bundled up in warm clothes and hats and gloves. It had not occurred to me to check with the guide about his route, nor had it occurred to him. All was fine as we were moving along the asphalt trail until suddenly he veered off the asphalt trail and down a fairly steep, muddy hill. I hesitated momentarily, but thought, I can do this, pulled a wheelie, and managed to get myself down the hill in one piece. But as the walk continued, it got harder and harder for me to keep up in the mud. Embarrassed, I told the people in the back line to let the leader know that I was going to find my way back to the asphalt trail and for no one to worry. I texted my friend who was also leading at the Santa Ana Wildlife Refuge in a different place and told her I was fine. I spent the next hour or so making a very circuitous but much flatter route back to the asphalt trail. I was freezing, I was full of mud, and I was elated. As I was wandering back to the asphalt trail, I was able to pick up the Altamira oriole, the green jay, the gray kiskadee, and an entire flock of plain chachalacas. It was wonderful, and I felt as accomplished as I would have following all those walking people along that muddy trail. It's important to be alone in nature, and I like to use the word unattended. I know each of you has treasured that feeling, that intimacy, that life-giving privacy of being alone in nature. When I'm alone in nature, I show up. I have to. No one else is there. It's incredibly moving and empowering to meet yourself on a trail. Perhaps it's more important for people with access challenges to be alone in nature. Many have situations where they never do get to spend time alone, unattended, and especially in nature with its own barriers. It's important for them to be alone in nature in a healthy way. And It's important to be with people in nature when you have an access challenge. Determined to participate, but never to impose on the itinerary of the trip leader or on the experience of the other birders. I'm very reluctant to ask for help, and still am. The result, of course, is that I figure out how to manage a lot of difficult situations. That too is empowering. I also teach others along the way the importance of independence for people who have access challenges and to respect that drive. Recently, I wrote up some tips for people who use wheelchairs to bird. And you'll notice that in each one of the tips, it is how to ask people for help. I want you to notice how good I am at telling other people how to ask for help. First, I talk to them. The tip asks, if you can do a wheelie through difficult short surfaces, do it. That way you'll be able to do it independently. If you, by difficult surfaces, I mean grass and mulch and sand. If you cannot do it, ask someone to help. You don't want to miss the bird being stubborn. Number two, if you enter a bird blind and you find it's full and you're not able to make your way to the viewing window, wait for someone to make that move. If no one does make that move, then ask. Number three, if you encounter a gate or a step or some other obstacle and you can't do it alone, ask for help. My experience is that people really do want to help. They want you to tell them how, and they end up feeling as valuable as you do when you're able to see the bird and accompany everybody else on the trip. Let me recount a wonderful experience that I had with people. In 2018, the shorebird class left the classroom at the Hornsby Bend Treatment Center in Austin, Texas. We climbed into our cars and headed to the nearby mudflats for the August migration. Birders park, unload their scopes, and one after another create the scope line. 10 scopes trained on a scattering of shorebirds in front of us and listening to each other and to the birds. I have not been able to participate fully in that scope line. We would try, birders would lower their scopes and situate the tripods around my wheels and try as we might. You know, it just was always frustrating for me. I decided it was time. 1 week later, with a new scope and a wheelchair attachment in hand, I too unloaded my scope and headed for the scope line with their conversations already underway. If you've never been a part of a scope line, you're missing something. It's an unbelievable bonding and camaraderie that you haven't ever experienced in the same way. Birders are all scanning the flock, the birds in front of them, and they're talking directly into their scopes. And they're checking field marks, and the conversation goes something like this. Second group from the left lined up with the third power pole. Another birder says, chevrons? Yup. Another says, same group, second bird from the right. You can almost hear them thinking. They're checking their field marks, and someone calls out, pectoral. Another says, the one facing us? Preening now? Yes. As I said, all birders are talking directly into their scopes. And for years, as I said, I was not able to participate, but now I made my way to the scope line. I found a place, I've focused my eyepiece, and I was on the same bird at the same time as everybody else. And I looked up joyfully from my scope and I said, guys, I'm part of the scope line. And they all smiled and said, yes, yes, you are, directly into their scopes, and not one took his eye off the birds. It was a wonderful experience. I'll never forget it. The more birding I did, the more I understood and expanded my own abilities, physical and otherwise. And the more I embraced the difficulties and uncertainties, I like to say I reframed them. And the amount of energy that we put into what's difficult can be instead focused on realizing that on the other side of that is joy and empowerment. Nature's challenges for a person in a wheelchair have given me the greatest joys of my life. Perhaps you will recognize some of them. Beauty, friendships, self-confidence, independence, lifelong learning, meaningful purpose, community, travel, and of course, the birds. And with all that, my best self and a happiness I'd never known. I became convinced that the best each of us can be is waiting for us in nature. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Virginia. What a wonderful set of stories, and it's just a great message. And I'm sort of prompted to say, you know, having just heard your story, or storylets as they are, you're clearly a person, a powerhouse of, you know, energy and optimism and can-do spirit. But was there ever a time, perhaps immediately after your accident, when you saw the world in bleaker terms?
Yes, and I love that question. My first response is, I've never seen the world in bleak terms. I will say that immediately after my injury, there was no time to grieve. I was injured, spent 4 months in the hospital, and was delivered safely back into my home and my family 2 weeks before I started 9th grade. So as you can imagine, 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, there was no time. I immediately started college 2 weeks after I graduated from high school, and then all the way through college. Really, I didn't spend much time grieving at all until I was maybe in my late 30s, when I had a little more time to do so. Great question.
Interesting, right? Yeah. I guess life has a way of just, you know, making sure that you got to cling on, right? You just got to keep going.
Yeah, you just keep going.
Right, absolutely.
Sometimes I like to say, well, I would have stopped except the sun kept coming up.
Yeah, and that's right. The sunshine is a good thing, right?
Yeah.
You talked in your story about the importance of being able to be alone in nature. That really resonates with me. Or as you put it, unattended, which I think is a critical word, isn't it? Especially in with the world as you live it, right? That's something that really resonates, I think, with members of our outdoor communities all over the country, and indeed all over the world, probably.
Right.
Why do you think that human need is so important and so affecting to people?
I wondered about that question, and I wondered if maybe people feel the same way I do, which is that I find when I am with others, I defer sort of subconsciously again and again to whomever is there. I distract myself with conversation and discussion and just joking. But when I'm alone, as I said, I'm face to face with a portion of me that doesn't show up sometimes unless I am alone. And it may be that way for others. I think other people find a way to be in nature without having to do the kind of mental thinking that I'm talking about, when it's like, oh, hello, self. They relax from that, perhaps. They are in a situation when they are human beings instead of human doings, as we all know. I think also the silence, just the silence of being alone in nature is nurturing.
Right. I'm also wondering if it's a question of scale. Certainly when I am out in nature, I love to hike, and sometimes it's a great leveling experience to be out and, you know, and standing at the foot of a mountain or a hill.
Yes.
You know, and suddenly we're all kind of insignificant, and, you know, and it's an honest thing, I think.
Exactly. I'm glad you said that, Mike. I used to pose that question to my students. I used to teach juniors in high school, and the prompt was, when we're out in nature, for many of us, we gaze out at an ocean or we gaze out at a horizon, and we think to ourselves, oh my gosh, I just don't matter that much. My first thought is, oh, thank goodness. And I ask my students, how many of you feel that way? How many of you feel like you're more significant when you're gazing out? How many of you feel like you're less significant? And what is that? Why is that? It's an interesting question.
It is. I'm curious to know what they said. Did they say that they feel more significant?
Oh, so many of them said, oh, I didn't know that was how I was affected.
Oh, okay.
I didn't know that it reduced my importance in the world, and that is a good thing, because I think for a lot of people, they don't want their importance to be reduced.
Yes.
They want to feel very important, and I'm just the opposite. I'm like, please, please let me be more insignificant.
That's great. Yeah, that's a good answer. So we have a question from Anne in the audience, and she says, I love hearing how you've pushed yourself.
Yeah.
And a specific question, is your adapter for the spotting scope made specific for the chair that you use, or is such a thing, you know, universally available?
No, and it's such a great question, such a great answer. I am shameless. And so I took my scope and I wheeled into Precision Camera, and I went to the information desk. I said, this scope needs to be attached to this chair before I leave. And the guy says, I know just the person for you. And he sends me to the desk. And this guy is so excited with this challenge. And 3 or 4 people come over, and they're dashing all over the store to come up with this really beautiful elbow. Well, you know, these guys are like geeks. They're like camera geeks. They love it. They're their own nerds, right? And so they're running around. Someone yells, G-clamp, and off he goes. And I'm like trying to wheel around after them, but finally I just go back to the desk and wait. And they come back, and within 15 minutes, my scope is attached to my chair.
Oh, that's great.
It was awesome. And so what I did immediately was take pictures of all of those parts of the scope, and I put them on my blog.
Ah.
I was blogging regularly, I guess 2 or 3 years ago. And then once the website was created, we put that scope and the parts of that scope on the resources page. And then Madison Audubon called me once they saw that, and they said, we want one of those attachments. How do we get it? And I said, here are all the parts. Go to your nearby camera store. And she said, we want to have one just on hand with a lightweight scope that they can put on the platform, so that anyone who comes who's in a wheelchair can have a chance that G-clamp goes anywhere on any scope. So, you know, those attachments are always going to be improving. And I'm not sure it takes an engineer or a rocket science to figure out how to get a scope attached to a chair. But I will tell you, it is such a wonderful experience to be in a wheelchair in charge of your own scope and being able to participate so fully. Like that's it's one of the greatest experiences I've had.
Yeah, it must be very liberating, right? Yeah.
It is.
Yeah. So we have another question from the audience. Dale would like to know, as a person who delivers nature-based programs, what's the best way for everybody, for us, to make sure that our programs are as inclusive as possible? And I think that's a question asked by Dale from New Jersey Audubon.
Right, exactly. Well, I will say that when all of this began, I created something called the Access Challenges document. And of course, at the time, I was thinking only about people who have mobility challenges. And so I identified what I perceived as the 9 things that walking people needed to know when we were trying to create an accessible site. And in those 9 items, I gave some details about measurements and purposes and why a railing needs to be a certain height so that it's not created perfectly to obstruct a seated person's view, all of those types of things. Those access considerations, as you can imagine, in the last year have expanded dramatically because we wanted to include all kinds of other audiences. We wanted to include those who were blind. I may be anticipating your next question. Do you want me to wait?
No, go ahead. I was simply going to say, yeah, what are the other challenges beyond?
Right. And so as people who are looking at birdability became more and more interested, we realized, well, we have to include the blind and the low vision. We have to include people who are deaf or hard of hearing. We have to include those with autism and other neurodivergent conditions, any health condition that keeps a person, maybe even subconsciously, from feeling comfortable about joining what we might call a regular bird walk. Right. And, while I'm on that point, Mike, I'd like to say that when I begin my presentations, I always ask my audience, so who do you think this birdability is for? And people will contribute. Well, this is a program for people in wheelchairs, or people who have walkers, or people who are in scooters. And then I just wait. Wait time is very important as a teacher. And eventually someone says, you know what? It's for all of us, isn't it? Because in 10 years or 20 years or 30 years, God willing, aren't we all going to want to be birding?
Yeah.
And so once you realize that this is not something for others, this is for you. Yeah. It's for your mom. Mm-hmm. It's for your grandmother. It's for everyone who's done bushwhacking.
Right, for your older self. Yeah. That's a really good point. A really good point.
Yeah, and so at that point we realize, oh, it's for all of us.
Yeah.
Isn't that a great feeling?
It is. Yeah, that's terrific. How long has Birdability been around?
Well, curiously, it's been about 3.5 years, and I just tired of trying to join all the walking people's birdathons, and there were never ever any other people in wheelchairs who had troubles keeping up. And I didn't really have troubles keeping up, I have to say, until a few years later when my joints were speaking to me. And I decided I'm gonna have my own birdathon, and I'm gonna bird dawn to dusk. And I'm gonna go to the 5 or 6 accessible, there actually are 30 accessible parks that I've identified in Austin. So I chose the 6 that were birdiest and started off, that was going to be my plan. And the local media found out about it. The National Audubon found out about it. And 2 weeks before the birdathon, they sent a photojournalist. Oh, they called me and said they wanted to send a photojournalist to follow me on my birdathon. And they also had a local journalist follow me. And when I was naming my particular birdathon, the word birdability just landed in my mouth. And that was really the beginning of Birdability. And my friends were like, we want to come. And I'm like, absolutely not. No walking people are allowed on this trip. And of course we all laughed, right? Because the irony is so precious. Right. But mainly I wanted to make the point that I'm going alone. And I'm going alone, I'm going unattended for a reason. And that is, it's not accessible unless I can go unattended.
Right.
And we need to celebrate and worship the time that we get to spend unattended in nature.
Absolutely, as you've said. So I'm curious to know, you talk about in the Austin area, there are 31, I think you said, sites that you would consider accessible.
Yeah.
How would you assess it might be a very difficult question to answer, but how would you assess the national picture?
It's trying, but and I appreciate the effort, but it needs some one-on-one. My experience in the birding that I've done over the last 20 years is that typically parks, national parks, city parks, county parks are very, very, very open to anything you can do to help them. For instance, just last week, the Balcones Canyonlands called me, and it's a beautiful wildlife refuge outside of Austin. And they said, we are redoing our trails and we want to make sure that we are doing the ADA trail properly. Would you mind coming up? And so I said, no, that's what I live for. I love doing that. So I drove up there and I spent about 2.5 hours with them on their trail. And they were taking notes the entire time as I was pointing out things that they needed to improve upon or things that were really well done along the way. So that's just fun. I do find that for smaller places, maybe even private parks like the McAllen Nature Center, I will come back after having scouting that site, let them know what needs to be improved upon. And it's a very friendly, cheerful talk. It's all positive. None of it includes a bulldozer or a subpoena. And they typically say, how are we going to get the money to do this? And my response 9 times out of 10 is, oh, that's not hard. Let's brainstorm the 10 most important local businesses in McAllen and see if maybe they would like to have the only accessible birding site in the Rio Grande Valley, which is kind of a no-brainer. So, it's just guiding people into doing what they want to do anyway.
Right. Well, talking about everybody, there's another question from the audience, which is, how can I support Birdability as a national movement? So if I'm not, Texas-based, for example, how can I help?
Well, let me tell you a little bit about how we formed a Birdability captain group. Right away, Mike, I started getting phone calls from all over the country. This really was 3 years ago. People who read my blog, and they're like, we want to do what you're doing. How do you do it? What do you do? And so I simply wrote up the steps that I had taken in order to get Birdability going in Austin. And I had just identified all of the groups that I knew were going to have people who had access challenges. I presented to each one of them and slowly but surely collected a contingent of birders. And the people who were calling from all over the country used those steps to start making their locales accessible. And I just designated them Birdability captains, with some funny gesture and some sounds. And I said, you hereby by the power invested in me.
Right, some frankincense.
Yeah, exactly. Trying to not be sacrilegious here. But anyway, it was wonderful because now we have over 50 captains across the world.
Wow.
Who have called in and said, we want to do what you're doing. How do you do it? And so that's one way that you can support Birdability. And I have to say, I talk for an hour and listen. I should say, we have an hour-long conversation before any of those Birdability captains are joined or are included, mainly because I want to make sure that our spirits are aligned and that we're doing the work that we really want to do and that they really want to also. So that is one way to support Birdability, is by exploring the options of being a captain. The other ways, of course, are donations. The other ways, of course, are supporting your local Audubon, because they too, each Audubon chapter across the country is working to become more accessible. And if you know that you have some talent to help find the accessible spots, I know that your local Audubon and bird clubs are just dying to get some people to help them make sure that their birding spots have accessible options.
Oh, that's terrific. So do you officially have Birdability chapters, or is it just individuals who you call captains?
We right now just have individuals that we call captains. We are seriously considering the chapter idea, and I'm sure that's just a matter of time, putting together chapters. So I like the idea a lot, though.
Terrific. So I'm going to close it off with one final question, Virginia, which is,
okay.
Obviously we're about to head into 2022.
Right.
Do you have a birding New Year's resolution? And if so, what is it?
I do. I don't do resolutions just at New Year's. I do them all the time when I realize I'm off the track. I'm like, get yourself back on the track. So resolutions year round. But the resolution personally for me is to be able to bird in Costa Rica or Panama. I've never had a chance to bird outside the US, and that would just be a dream come true for me. I may have to sort of air glide my way in and out of Costa Rica, or there's something we're playing with, which is called a rickshaw, and I'll have my own Sherpa with grapes and palm fronds and stuff to push me up and down the mountains in Costa Rica. But that's really a resolution. It's going to take a lot of research for me to find that.
Yeah, sounds wonderful though. Yeah.
Yeah, it does.
Well, Virginia, thank you so much. As great as this has been, sadly, it's time to wind it down until the next time we meet. So on behalf of us all, I want to thank Virginia Rose for her incredibly inspiring story. And Virginia, we wish you all the very best as you continue to do great things with your team at Birdability. It really is. It's wonderful to hear and very inspiring.
Well, thank you, Mike. It's been so much fun visiting with you, and thank you for your guidance and putting the story together. Thank you.
Of course, it's been a real pleasure. And my thanks also, of course, go to Lillian and Tom, who are the production team on That's Wild today. So goodbye, everybody, and we'll see you next time on That's Wild, Tales from the Human Side of Nature. Stay well and stay wild. Goodbye.